All right, I feel like saying welcome back like we're on TV. I've never had the chairs up here like this, so this is actually going to be a first time we do this experiment. So I want everybody to please welcome Hemma, Prafullchandra. We are very, very fortunate to have Hemma join us today. Just a quick background and an introduction, and then we'll have a fireside chat, as we say, and talk a little bit about technology, cybersecurity, and best practices that we have. So Hemma joins us from Microsoft. She's been at Microsoft for just over a year.
Exactly a year today.
Exactly a year today?
Yes.
Wow, we get your balloons. But yeah, so that's fantastic. So you are responsible, you're the CTO for M365 Security and Compliance.
Yes.
And M365 includes Office 365, Windows. Can you maybe help us
definitely.
know a little bit more about what's in there?
So it's all our productivity suite, collaboration, as well communications, as well as Windows. So Office 365, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, Yammer, Skype for Business, Stream, Teams, and as well as Windows.
All products that we use enthusiastically, and actually we support with many of our portfolio as well. And as CTO, you help inform the security and compliance vision, product plans, and you work with partners, customers, analysts to help build Microsoft's mind share around the cybersecurity strategy and solutions. Now, you've been there a year. We at Barracuda, we talk about our journey. We talk about the Barracuda journey. We talk about our customers' journeys. I would love for maybe you could share with us your journey in your career. Where did you start and how did you get to where you are today?
It's a great question. So I've been in the industry 30 plus years, and I did my undergrad in England, so at University College London, and I've worked in that 30 years at 8 companies, Microsoft being the 8th, 4 large and 4 small. And I want to say Microsoft is the largest company I've ever worked for. So, we're about 130,000 employees worldwide. The second largest probably was Sun Microsystems. And, in terms of my journey, I started in the networking, and I was at the college doing OSI work, thinking about doing a master's in the US. So I was actually talking to a company that was in Palo Alto called the Wollongong Group. And they had built out the open source toolkit in those days for the OSI stack. It was called ISO-D. So instead of OSI, it was the ISO standards, the open environment. So Marshall Rose was visiting the college, and I was like, okay, what's Stanford like? What's Berkeley like? Thinking I was going to do my master's, but I ended up joining the Wollongong Group and moved from England to essentially the Bay Area, and haven't moved since. So settled here, I love the Bay Area. But what that led to was, so worked on OSI, networking initially, and had moved across the road and joined Sun Microsystems. So that's the beauty of living and working in the Bay, that you could literally cross the road and join another company. But what happened was the OSI stack wasn't very popular in the early 90s in the US. There was very little market traction, but there was traction in Europe, so they moved the project and the team to France. So I had the opportunity to go, relocate back to Europe, and I decided not to and find another position, and I ended up working on the OS. So that's when I moved to security and started working on security of the operating system, and back then it was BSD, and lived through the whole journey of BSD to SVR4 to Solaris. And again, Sun Microsystems, very anti-Microsoft. So I would have never considered Microsoft as a company I would work for until I met Satya 3 years ago, maybe about 4 years ago. And I realized that Microsoft has changed quite a bit in terms of their culture and their focus. And, and I had also, like where I am in my career and my journey, I was ready to look for a company where I could give a lot back, right? A company that was doing good from not just products and revenue, but securing the world, but giving back. So Microsoft has a lot of programs like Defending Democracy. We have open source toolkits around homomorphic encryption to help folks that are building voting systems to integrate that. So a lot of sort of social impact as well, and it was important to me at this point. I've worked both as an individual contributor as well as a manager, and I go back and forth depending on the organization and the role. I tend to always start a new company as an individual contributor. And the thought process there is I know exactly what my capabilities are, and I know I can learn and contribute in my first year. And that allows me to then also think about a team that I would want to establish and the focus of that team.
Excellent. Wow.
I could go on.
Very impressive. I actually, as you were talking about the Sun Microsystem, I didn't realize that you and I had actually connected in multiple different avenues. So I also spent time at Sun Microsystems around the same time. Actually, you were probably there a little bit earlier than I was, in the early 90s. I was there in the 2000s.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how that company kind of evolved from being very innovative, very leading, and then also went through kind of that transformation challenge where after Spark and Solaris and the x86 movement came in, they needed to kind of do a little bit of soul searching and find, I think by then you probably would have moved on.
So I left in 97.
Yes.
And, internally there was always this, the last stop was JavaSoft.
Yep.
So I had done my movement around the planets because Sun was also trying to figure out how to remain relevant and had its, sort of beginnings in hardware. And now there was a lot more software with not only the operating system, but all the Java soft capabilities from servers to the JDK. And so there was a struggle trying to figure out, what's the right structure for the organization, how do you stay relevant, how do you stay focused, based on your competitors. So all kind of very sort of, for me it was a lot of learning. I think I also learned while I was at Sun the importance of standards and public policy. We built a lot of technologies. I mean, I was at one time working on our sunscreen firewall product. So we had built a firewall product based on Diffie-Hellman, a whole new set of standards that we were trying to get established in IETF, and pushing the envelope on export controls, because back then crypto was treated as, under the Department of Defense, and we wanted it moved in terms of our ability to export crypto more easily. So, when you think about products and technology, it's not enough that you have an innovative product, but you really have to think through the customer journey in terms of their adoption of the technology. And any barriers that they may have, it's, the vendor needs to bear some of that burden, because you won't have success unless the customers can adopt. So if they're, for example, if you look at public clouds right now, for the longest there was so much concern about customers adopting public clouds that we had to work across standards bodies, regulatory frameworks to make sure that they allowed for the enterprises to adopt public clouds. I remember when I was at HITRUST, where I met Hatem, that I had to spend almost I want to say 2.5 years in the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council to establish that any workloads that were processing payment cards, or so credit cards essentially, could be virtualized. Something that's simple, right? It took almost 2.5 years to establish the guidance and the changes in the standard to say, yes, you can run your payment processing environments in a virtualized environment. We hadn't even got to public clouds, just even in your own data center, right? That was virtualized, it was not allowed.
This is very interesting because, throughout my career, I've seen where the adoption of technology can go far faster, right? In many ways, open source can be a huge driver for innovation, and then on the back of that comes kind of the standardization.
Yes.
And so when we look at how we drive the security conversation, for much of what Barracuda drives, we see huge adoption in public cloud. We see our products kind of migrating to public cloud. We see things like Azure really begin to get huge adoption, AWS get huge adoption. But there's always that apprehension, right, that the CISO level conversation about, well, is this really accepted? Are the standards there? Is the data compliance there? We were talking earlier about the importance of protecting the customer's data versus the developers who are moving quickly, want to drive that level of innovation and kind of build that digital transformation for that customer. Right. How have you seen kind of the security conversation evolve as you've moved maybe through high trust and, you know, with the VMware pieces all the way now to public cloud and Microsoft?
Right, right. So I think what I'm seeing and what I've seen is that there was a second wave. There were early adopters of cloud-based solutions, and whether they're applications that are running in, say, Azure or AWS or GCP, the three main clouds right now, or there are SaaS applications. What we've seen is that the first wave of adopters are now facing other challenges. So, for example, I was in Pittsburgh meeting with the two largest healthcare enterprises or institutes in Pittsburgh. One of them is much further along, so they've adopted cloud-based solutions. And they're now running into what their next set of challenges, which is now their clinicians and physicians are self-selecting a lot of SaaS applications, but those SaaS applications are from vendors that are not savvy in security. They're sort of more focused on cancer treatment, right? So they're providing that niche capability that the physician must have, but they're not aware of the security implications of running a SaaS application with patient healthcare data. So that's kind of like one who's adopted, but now facing another set of challenges. The other, were still asking me questions that what I would have said were stage zero. So they were asking questions about, like, how can I, what guarantees or assurances can I provide that Microsoft will not divulge or compromise their patient data or access their patient data, right? So they're still worried about—
Very basic. NDA
I would say
level
exactly stage
yeah.
zero, right? Like, oh, I was like, and I was thrown back, right? Because I had the room full of legal officer, their data officer, their privacy officer, you know, so more, not the CISO, but all the other functions. And so that's the other reality, which is as people are more mature on their digital transformation journeys, which includes, you know, either cloudification or greater automation or use of IoT, analytics, right? So just a lot more data. What we're seeing is that what could have been siloed in the past, the functions in an org, are now having to collaborate a lot more. However, they don't have the tools or the language to be able to have that conversation. So we're having to facilitate a lot more discussions between legal and the IT department and the security department. I think the IT and security have resolved their sort of language or point of view issues, but the legal or the risk management functions are still very removed. So
I know there's a few people in this room who are actually smiling about that, because we do that here internally a lot as well. And I think it's important to recognize, especially from an engineering perspective, that this is a reality that a lot of our customers are facing. That when we think about how we develop and how quickly we want to innovate, sometimes we feel these things kind of hold us back. Maybe we add VPN capabilities or MFA capabilities. I have an inbox full of people complaining sometimes about those. But these are actually part and parcel of the conversation that you're having at customers, because they're very anxious about what the products are, the shadow IT that comes in, and the compliance requirements that come with it. And in many ways, it's a partnership between the organizations.
And I think the other challenge is when you just look at it from the enterprises having to secure themselves with the number of vendors, right? So the cybersecurity space, there's sort of a lot of well-established companies, but then you see some of them, like if you look at Symantec being acquired by Broadcom, or McAfee that was, acquired by a PE firm, or is now part of a PE firm, or even Barracuda, which is part of Thoma Bravo portfolio. When you think about those changes and the number of startups that are in this space, from a CISO or a security organization, the skills and the time required to do the due diligence and evaluations is really difficult. But what's also happening at the same time is the pace of delivery has increased. It's completely, we're like Microsoft. In my group alone, we have a 6-month cadence. So every 6 months, we deliver a whole number of new capabilities or enhancements to existing capabilities. Now, if you think about an organization having to consume all this, and on average, we're finding that a large enterprise has something like 60 security solutions in their environment. 60 is on average. It's some more, some less, but 60 is the average. And they want to consolidate, they want to reduce the number of solutions, but they don't want to create gaps, right? So they have technologies. But when you think about it, like if you need 60 specialists, one per product, just to say, right? That understands the product, understands the cadence of delivery, understands the maintenance cycles, even if it's cloud delivered. They are responsible for the configuration and the impact the configurations will have in terms of downtime, or are they still secure? That's a lot of work for the enterprise. So ease of use is critical. The greater, so the more you can automate for the customer or start doing recommendations or suggestions, so that an average skilled person can also maintain that product, the better it is.
This is part of what we were just talking about before you joined us.
Perfect.
Which is really driving.
You guys are on the right track.
So this is good to hear. Now, in your time, you said you were individual contributor and you also ran teams, and you've run relatively large engineering teams, been kind of at the center of cybersecurity attacks and going on. Share with us a little bit about some of the best practices and some of the trends you see from an engineering perspective that are important for us to be thinking about.
Yeah, so I mean, throughout, and I touched a little on some of this, which is, the importance of other barriers, to being sort of thoughtful and understanding the barriers of adoption, right? So what typically happens is the dev and the QA team follow whatever the product management folks have said here are the requirements, and they tend to be very removed from the customer. So the product managers end up being the conduit, and some are very good, some are not so good in terms of being able to have those conversations with the customers, identifying common patterns and only allowing those common patterns to get to it so that you can address all your customer needs, right? So trying to avoid the one-offs. But once you have a customer and they're, a large customer, well-established, they're your marquee, you end up having to do a lot for that one customer, right? I mean, so Hatem,
we know that pain, yes.
Yep, Hatem, we did a lot of that. And I think that's necessary, but you always have to, that's where one of those situations where engineering needs to step up and say, yes, I understand this is potentially just for this one financial institute, but how do I make it so that every other customer can benefit from that one-off as well? This is not where a PM needs to, start making additional requirements, because they're already sort of spanning a lot of customers. And so to deep dive on a single, it's just difficult. So that would be one. The other area that I've found, so customer-centric, really critical. Having the entire organization understand the customers is important. So like at Hatem, as an example, one of the things I had implemented was quarterly exchange, or if you can do it more frequently, every other month, an exchange between the field, your sales engineers, your professional services folks, and your engineering team, to have direct communication. Because what we found is that a professional service, a consultant at the customer environment may have spent sufficient time to understand the workflows, and they look at the product and they go, this is not working, right? And if they are in the room at the same time, so not necessarily in the room physically, but through Zoom or whatever technology you're using, if not Teams, I see. But
not yet, but yeah.
yeah. But I think it's that dialogue.
Yeah.
Being able to get through sort of language or communication challenges to say what is the real need for the customer and their workflows, so that the product actually just works.
So encouraging those interactions.
Just a lot more.
Excellent.
And I think doing it together. So that was, the time commitment to have the entire engineering, the entire technical team get on a 2-hour sort of session every other month or once a quarter. It's huge when you think about the size of the org, but so critical, because what we found is that when we hold those 2 hours, people also start getting to know each other and their personalities. And so later, if there is an issue in the field team doesn't feel so bad about sending, we use Slack as an example, sending a Slack message so that they can directly communicate.
Build that interaction already.
Exactly. And there's always guidance required, right? Like how much engineering time is spent supporting directly the field versus other functions you might have in between. Because obviously if they're doing that, they're not coding, and you really need progress on the products and timeline commitments there. But there's also how much of what might be shared by engineering, who might be translating code or a roadmap or a timeline. So making sure the field understands that there is the official roadmap and there is the internal roadmap, right? Like, so what you can share with customers is also something you have to control and make sure it's appropriate.
Excellent. That's actually really good feedback. I think that's something we've been struggling a little bit with how to do effectively, and one of the things we want to look at. Now, we have about 500 engineers.
Yeah.
I think as a younger, smaller company, we've built different organizations coming in through acquisitions, through hiring. But when we look around and you kind of see the groups within here, and this is one of the conversations we've had in the past, the importance of thinking about diversity and thinking about that not just from a backing into it, but actually being more proactive about it. And I want to kind of get your thoughts about why you think it's important now and today, what it means, especially in the context of an engineering organization and a security company.
Right.
From your experiences.
Yeah, so I think the biggest sort of factor to think sort of forward-looking is the shortage of skills, right? And we anticipate if I just look at the public numbers, that by 2020, right, so that's just like around the corner, right, or 21. So in the next sort of 2 years, we're going to have a shortage of 2.5 million individuals with security skills, given the number of enterprises and vendors that need that same skill set globally, right? But specifically in US, it's 2.5, I believe, million. So being able to look at diversity, not only from a gender perspective, but backgrounds and skill sets is important. And the closest analogy I can draw, and I think will sort of resonate with security people, is when you start doing security products and you think about how you can make sure that you have quality detection, whether it's for phishing or it's malware in your environment on the endpoints, we look at at least at Microsoft, there are three things that we look at. The first is the volume of signals. And if you've seen any of the Microsoft write-ups, you'll see that we talk about 6.5 trillion signals per day that we actually analyze and do analytics over. So volume is interesting, but it's not enough. Because if you have a volume and it's, say, if in our case, if it was all just DNS or internet facing related, it wouldn't be very helpful to detect what's going on within the enterprise in a tenant environment, meaning in our own cloud. So diversity of those signals is also important. So making sure we can look at signals from different workloads, whether it's Office or whether it's endpoint or it's in Teams and chat, right? That we can actually see and correlate patterns across those, and endpoints including mobile, right, with our Intune capabilities. And so diversity is important there, and we call it variety. And then the last is velocity, right? How quickly are those signals coming in, our ability to analyze and actually make, go through some reasoning and have either a clear detection of something that we need to investigate, or it just informs us to, for the next, right? Being able to correlate across multiple events. When I look at that and I look at our own kind of careers and diversity and how we could be successful, I think looking at your own personal networks, making sure that and obviously I've been using LinkedIn for a long time, and LinkedIn is a Microsoft portfolio company, but that's a great platform, right, to build out your personal networks. And sort of the thought process there is that depending on different situations, you need to look at different signals. In this case, you need to connect with different individuals to get independent perspectives on a particular, problem that you're trying to solve. Whether it's personal or in a work environment, it's always good to get that additional perspectives. So look at your sort of LinkedIn and networks and see if you have diverse, both from gender and experience perspective, to get that feedback. And then from an organization perspective, Microsoft's been on this cultural change journey ever since Satya became our CEO. And we've implemented quite a few programs. I mean, it's from all the way from the top, where we have diversity and inclusion as one of the pillars of our culture. And not only from a programmatic perspective, but also from a performance perspective. So what we realized is to make lasting change, we actually have to put teeth in the program. So it's not sufficient that we talk about values and we talk about, people should behave this way, and we talk about mentors and allyship, but every performance review for every individual, there's a section that actually addresses what have you done, how have you behaved, what are some of the things that you've encouraged in that D&I space, right? And so I feel that accountability makes for a successful sort of culture change program. And so, there's a lot of information available, because we kind of share some of this also on our website, that might be interesting for Barracuda depending on where you are in your journey to implement.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We're in the process. I'd say we're definitely, as I mentioned earlier, we're conscious of it, we're very aware of it. I think there's more to do in terms of what we want to drive both at the individual level and at the broader level.
Yeah.
I think learning and understanding what Microsoft does, much bigger company, and I think they've got a much more global presence to drive that, is super helpful to drive that. So I think that'll be some of the follow-up that maybe we'll have an aspect to.
Yeah.
Now we at Barracuda have a pretty deep relationship with Microsoft. We've actually just recently kind of upped that relationship and established a much more strategic engagement. We've improved the relationship on the aspect of the Azure side, and we've been working very closely with the Azure team as we deploy our solutions. But we've also worked very closely with the aspects that are part of your responsibility. I know I get this question a lot, so it's one of the things I would love to get your perspective on. Office 365 being one of the most successful SaaS products in the industry. I think, and just kind of share with you, our perspective is that Microsoft partners a little different when it comes to Office 365, maybe views us a little different as a security provider on top of that versus the work that we do with the Azure side. In your role, I would love to understand a little bit better how we should be thinking about that.
Yeah, and what I'll say is that Azure, as a cloud provider, obviously AWS led the way and set the sort of model, the business model. With Azure, you have a marketplace. And so every partner who has built capabilities on Azure can transact through the marketplace. So customers, right, joint customers can discover the capabilities, make their own decisions, and transact via the marketplace and get a single bill. So with the Azure, the business model was really easy and well established because it started from nothing, and there was a model that Amazon had established. So every, I think, public cloud provider is following the same model. And it's very important because I think the customers don't, again, going back to too many vendors, so across the board, procurement, right?
Yeah.
Compliance assessments, throughout an organization acquiring a capability, there's many functions that have to get involved. So having fewer vendors, having gone through that supplier checklist makes it easier. I think on Office 365, we did not and do not have the same model. Right? So for Office 365, there isn't a marketplace per se. There's a gallery of solution providers, but then the transaction is very separate. So there is, it's early stages. Again, we're hearing from the customers also. So it's not just our partners, but the customers also, whether we can make that simpler. So, don't know. We'll see if there is more that comes out that are more similar to Azure, or whether the Azure Marketplace becomes the marketplace also for Office 365, right? We have a lot of work to do there. But I think from a partner perspective, we are for sure going to be a security and compliance solution provider. And so our team, so M365 Security and Compliance team, was formed last June. So while the solutions have been around, the team came together under the M365 umbrella last June, right? So we're, a year and a half year old as an organization, but as we established ourselves, we also had the freedom, instead of just thinking about first-party products and securing our first-party products, which totally makes sense, and that's what everybody expected Microsoft to do, we're beginning to look at other requirements. For example, being able to support the hybrid model. So not enough that we support only the SaaS application as it is delivered from our clouds, but also what's still running on-prem. So last week I was in Denver, met with 4 different customers, and the on-prem piece, so there are a lot of customers are still running Exchange on-prem, right? So while they're going through this migration to Office 365, they recognize that there are certain business processes or regulatory requirements that still requires them to keep some Exchange on-prem. So one of the asks is support that hybrid model really well. Windows is also part of our team, right? So Windows 10 capabilities, as an example, is where all our new security capabilities were, sort of first hits market. And a number of our customers, so we have 1 billion Windows endpoint on the planet. And when you think about 1 billion systems that you have to keep up to date, especially when they're not Windows 10, it's very problematic, right? So majority of those endpoints are still running either Windows 7 or Windows 8.1. So we are also backporting to those systems, and a lot of our customers are saying that it's not just Windows. We have Mac OS, we have Linux in our environment, we have iOS and Android. So make sure you support those as well.
Okay.
So scale is a big challenge, right? For when we think about it from a partner perspective, no partner can meet our scale. So, but where we really look to partners is we do not have necessarily the regional reach, that sort of last mile. A lot of our partners focus on that because while we can scale and we can have the global footprint, we don't necessarily have the last mile covered in terms of making sure that the customer understands how to configure our products, adopt them, or in the case of security, specific capabilities that are very, sector specific.
Sector specific,
Yeah.
or more use case specific.
Exactly.
Also be
Exactly.
a component of that. And we've seen actually a tremendous amount of success
Yeah.
with that. I think I give Microsoft an enormous amount of credit for their consistency and openness around the API strategy that they take. I think, you know, our experience with Microsoft, with the Graph API, for example,
Right.
and the work that you guys are doing around Security Center, it does feel that Microsoft, while having that global responsibility and, you know, the billion endpoints and tens of millions of Office 365 customers, hundreds of millions of Office 365 customers, security is your job number one, I would argue.
Exactly.
We have been very successful working with that platform and kind of making sure that the joint efforts between the two companies really bring a better security profile for our customers. And that's important for us, both on the engineering side and the sales side, to kind of understand how we drive that.
Right, and so, you know, we're also looking at customers are asking for easy buttons all the time. And so I touched on the gallery, right? And they're asking for, can we have checkboxes? So if we've already got integration with a partner, can they just select a checkbox? And I'll give SimSpace as an example, because it's easier to relate to, where, for example, if we have an integration with Splunk, then they just want to be able to checkbox and say, yes, as a tenant, I want my logs to be shared with my Splunk instance, and they'll, you know, be able to configure their Splunk information right in line. They don't want to have to go to multiple consoles to be able to enable, you know, say a Barracuda network integration in ours and then configure in Barracuda as well. If there is some way that we can hide the complexity of the integration under the hood, right, so that the customer only has like 2 checkboxes, right, maybe some IP address and other credentials and stuff that they may need to bootstrap the integration. So we're looking at that as well in terms of how can we make our partner integrations be even smoother for adoption for our customers.
Excellent. Well, great. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you so much for coming out. We have maybe a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions for Hemma, don't be shy. Grizel?
So you mentioned Microsoft getting into more of the security and compliance business side. So how do you see partners like Barracuda working with you when you yourself are getting into that space?
So a question we get all the time, right?
Let me just repeat the question just so people can hear it on the phone. So you just formed the security and compliance organization within Barracuda. How do you see within Microsoft, and how do you see Barracuda partnering in that context?
So it's a question we get from our partners all the time with this concern about if we're providing the capabilities, what does the partner do? And I believe that there are some innovations that are always going to be with the partners, right? So we're required by our customers almost to provide sort of the basic or the core controls, right? It's sort of the checkbox level. Yes, I've addressed the common use cases. So again, talking about scale, if we have so many customers of all sizes, right? From the very small to the very large enterprises with, you know, sort of hundreds of thousands of end users, we have to scale across that. We only have like one solution, one delivery. So we have to scale across all of them. All our capabilities for security and compliance, most of the capabilities, I want to say the customers are required to have an E5 license. If you are licensing, it's fairly complex, but you're required to have either an Office 365 E5 or an EMS E5 license, or now M365 E5. So very few people or very few customers actually have an E5 license, right? So it's targeting the very large. All the other customers, the mid-market, the small, we have, other than what's built in, right? So what's built into Office versus there's a layered product on top is the capabilities they will get, which are sort of minimum, right? There's password management, there's integration with Active Directory, or potentially another identity source, sort of the bare minimum. So I would say that there will always be a role for partners. And that's how Microsoft has actually grown, right? without our partner ecosystem, we would not be as successful as we are now. And so we continue with that model, but recognize that from a security perspective, there are going to be capabilities that we will deliver, but always be augmented with our partners for specific use cases, specific market segments, specific geos, right? Yeah.
Excellent. All right.
Okay.
Well, wait, one more question? Yes?
Hemma, you spoke about diversity and inclusion in your performance process with employees. Talk about it for a moment on how it shows up as you're acquiring talent or hiring people into Microsoft, and what are you're looking for or trying to describe as the message for potential employees.
Do you want to repeat the question?
I'll repeat the question real quick. So we talked about diversity and inclusion in our performance practice with Microsoft. Would love to understand a little bit more about how you acquire talent with the diversity and inclusion perspective, and how you message out and how you use that from a recruiting perspective.
Right. So from a values perspective, right? So we have our culture and values described on our website, and we kind of have a huge presence around D&I, so diversity and inclusion. But there are programs operated at the Microsoft Corp level. So again, given our size, we have every layer with programs. And then at the division level, so my group, M365 Security and Compliance, is part of the Experiences and Devices division, meaning we also have our hardware components there, Surface and HoloLens. But so we have at the division level, but my group, we're about 1,200 people, also has programs. And we think of them in three sort of specific areas. The first pillar is hiring, recruiting, early sort of the onboarding experience. And I'll touch on, I think that's where your question is, but I just wanted to touch on the other two. The second is early in career. So the first 5 years of an individual in our profession, they don't necessarily have to be fresh grads, right? They may be, we're finding that a lot of medical practitioners are moving into our space. And so early in career from both, they're changing industries, but also they may be fresh grads. And then the last is retention and thinking about all the folks that are sort of 5 years and beyond. How do you engage and keep them current and learning and motivated? And so on the hiring practices, so not from the corporate level, but in our group, we make sure that every position that is open, that we establish a diverse slate. Now what that means is that there are at least 2 people, that fit the diversity criteria for any number of, candidates you may have sourced. So kind of establish some kind of a minimum. That takes a while because it's hard to find sort of the diverse candidates. So we don't force it, meaning that you hire the best candidate based on the job, based on the timeline that you have to, right? But we've made it sort of a conscious expectation that the managers are going to make sure they have a diverse slate. Then the actual interview process, right? This is where we have typically a lot of fallout, right? From my experience. You want to make sure that you always end on a good note. So if you, as an example, have a female candidate come for an interview, make sure you end the day with a meet and greet of the other female candidates that you have on staff already. Because if they are interviewed only by the male folks on the team, which normally happens in our field because of just the stats we have, then they will leave thinking, oh, I don't know if I want to join in an environment that's just all men, right? Because that isn't the reality. It's just that you didn't end the day. And they can have all their questions answered depending on where they are in their stage in life. And then I think the last is we've also tried to be more creative in terms of where we recruit from. Right, so we go on campus, for example, and as I touched on, medical field is a very good one to hire from, but then allow for that training, right? So if you're hiring people that are detail-oriented, sort of good at communicating, highly energetic, and you still have to train them about our field. So buddy programs really work, but official orientation programs in terms of just bringing them up to speed, right? Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay.
Really good ideas. Thank you.
Most
Well, I want to
welcome.
thank you so much for just spending a little bit of time with us. It was very, very informative. Thank you very much for. We will take a 10-minute break and reconvene hopefully 10:50 or so with our next presenter.